Thank you for joining us. We're letting people in. Okay. It looks like we have just about everyone in. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sam Fletcher, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State chapter of NASW. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Rae and Ryan for coming today and telling us more about New York State Kinship and how we as social workers can support their work and get involved. And I'm just going to hand it over to Amelia to let you know how you're going to be interacting with us during this chat.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure you have all used Zoom at this point, but I'm just going to give us a little overview about how we're going to engage with one another today. So I just turned on our live transcription, so you should have that closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to have access to the full transcript, just click that little caret pointing up. It's going to give you a few options. You can choose to view the full transcript, which will come on the right side of your screen. You can also hide your subtitles if they're getting in the way. And also those subtitles you can click and drag and drop anywhere on the screen. So if they're in the way of your presentation or someone's face and you'd like to change where they are, you can just click and drag that to wherever you would like it to be. Right now, everyone is muted, but when we get to a time where you can ask questions or have conversation, we'd love to have anyone join us, unmute yourself, and speak to us to have that discussion. I also invite you to write into the chat box during the program if there's any comments or questions that you want to ask or something you want to say while the presentation is going on. We encourage you to do that in the chat box. Of course, always use your interactions if there's anything that you want to react to, also at the bottom of your screen. Other than that, the last thing I'm going to mention is that this is not a CE program. This does not hold CE hours in New York State. These programs are for some, we say social connection while physically distancing due to COVID, but chapter chats are really a great way for social workers to come together on any topic and share some resources and information. So that's all you need to hear from me. I'm going to hand it over to Rae and Ryan from the New York State Kinship System of Care, Kinship Navigator. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us today. We appreciate it. I'm Rae Glaser. I'm the director of the New York State Kinship Navigator program. I'm going to kick it off today, and then I'm going to hand it off to Ryan Johnson, who is our associate director of the New York State Kinship Navigator. So today we want to talk a little bit about the New York State System of Care, Kinship Navigator System of Care. I want to talk a little bit about kinship families, who they are, why kids come into kinship care, and why kin should be utilized. Ryan's going to talk a little bit about common caregiving concerns we see from our caregivers, and then we want to talk about the New York State Kinship System of Care. What social supports are out there, support services for caregivers, what does the New York State Kinship Navigator do specifically, how to get in touch with us, and what type of outreach and connections are available to families. So we're going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. Feel free to throw any chat questions in the chat box, and then we'll open it up at the end for your questions if you'd like to ask them live. So first of all, what is kinship care? When we're talking about kinship care, kinship caregivers, we're talking about non-parent relatives, such as grandparents, other relatives, and caregivers that we call fictive kinship caregivers, which may be family friends, godparents, neighbors, basically anybody that's stepping in to care for kids when the biological parents cannot care for them. They're caring for them full-time in their home in the absence of the biological parent. And it's basically anybody that is stepping in to provide parenting services to a child when the parents cannot parent. So why do kids typically come into kinship care? Well, they come into care for mostly the same reasons that you would see kids go into foster care. It's rarely for a good reason. You can see here, substance abuse, death, abuse, neglect, military deployment, mental health, incarceration. We did see a spike in caregiving when it came to COVID last year, when parents were unable to care for their children. It's rarely a good reason that they're coming into care. Usually parents want to parent their own children. So when there's something that's preventing that, we see the kinship caregivers stepping in to care for kids. What does that look like in New York State? Well, roughly about 1 in 11 children will live in a kinship home during their childhood. 1 in 5 Black children will live in a kinship home. You see about half of those kids are under the age of 6, and about a quarter are between 6 and 11 and between 11 and 17. When we talk about kinship caregivers, we always want to make sure that we are inclusive. And as I said, it can be grandparents, aunts, uncles, adult relatives, siblings, cousins, but usually we primarily see it as grandparents. We call it basic kinship math. There's 2 parents in a household. When you're seeing a lot of these risk factors come into play, usually only one parent is parenting. We don't see the fathers involved as much. It's usually mom raising her own child. And then if something happens to her, her mom will step in. So it's primarily grandparents, primarily maternal grandparents, but it's important to note that when we're talking about caregivers, we're talking about anybody. In New York State, there's roughly about 193,000 children that are living with relatives outside of the foster care system. About half of them have had contact with Child Protective Services, but they may not be placed in what we call the formal kinship care system, which is kinship foster care. We see a lot of families, like I said, about half of them that have not had contact with CPS may be having informal arrangements where they don't have any type of legal designation over the child. They may go through family court for legal custody or guardianship. They may have something called a parental designation form. Ryan's going to talk about all of that very soon. But if they are involved with Child Protective Services, they may or may not become a kinship foster parent. They may be placed in something called a safety plan, which is a temporary placement without any type of formal legal designation, or they may opt for another legal designation over the child that places them in the informal the informal kinship caregiving system. So why should we utilize kin? Well, it's very simple. Kinship care has been shown to have better protective factors for children that are in relative foster care or relative non-foster care rather than stranger foster care. They have better pregnancy outcomes. They are experiencing fewer school changes. They're being placed in something that is familiar to them. They have better behavioral and mental health outcomes. They're with familiar people. So I always would ask at this point in the conversation, which is much easier when you're in person, that if you were a child and you were unable to be in the home with your parent, would you rather be with a stranger or would you rather go into care with your aunt, your uncle, your grandma? Simply, these children that are in a really unfamiliar, stressful situation tend to do better when they are placed with relatives. They're able to keep connections to their siblings, extended family. It's a familiar place to them. Next slide, Ryan. However, there are some challenges for kinship families. When kids are placed with kinship caregivers, it's usually done very quickly. The relatives don't get a lot of lead notice. They're placed with kin, and then these relatives have to step in and be the parent. They have to look at making financial decisions, healthcare decisions. There's social behavioral challenges having to do with children that have experienced a lot of trauma in their lives. As we said earlier, a lot of these caregivers are grandparents, so they tend to be older. They are in a challenged socioeconomic status. They may be less educated. They're going through a lot of financial burdens. They may be on fixed income. Kids are not cheap. All the parents in the room know this, that when you've got a child put into your care, you all of a sudden have to think about food, clothing, maybe diapers, childcare. Enrolling into school, there's a lot of quick decisions to be made, and they're not cheap decisions. So you have to be willing to take on the financial burden. There's lots of questions about financial assistance and what other supports are available. They have to deal with kids that have some behavioral and emotional challenges. You know, they've been through a lot in their lives. These are kids that are traumatized, and caregivers are taking on their parenting role, and they have to think about that. And then they also have to deal with complex family relationships. If you're dealing with maternal grandma, you get the stigma sometimes that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, where if mom can't take care of her child, then where did grandma go wrong taking care of her child that mom can't take care of her child? So these are all things that kin have to think about. They have to go through the struggles that they go through as they are stepping in to care for children that are not their own. As I said before, outcomes for kinship children, this is worth restating, they tend to have better placement stability, quicker permanency. Once they're placed with relatives, they tend to stay there. They're less likely to re-enter foster care after returning to their birth parents. And I've also said too that it's noting again that children have high significant trauma ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences. But despite all of these challenges, they tend to thrive when they are placed with relatives as opposed to foster care with strangers. So that sets the stage for what we see with kinship caregivers, who they are, what they look like in New York, and what some of the protective factors are and why we should utilize kin. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now to talk about some of the common caregiving concerns that we see in New York State. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ray. I just want to first quick address a question from the chat regarding the opioid crisis. Yeah, there are a number of resources out there available that talk about kinship care and the opioid crisis. Generations United did a whole report that pulled in a lot of data. Generations United is a national kind of kinship care, what they refer to as grand families advocacy group based out of DC. And every year they do what they call a Grand Families Report. And one of the years, I think 2 years ago, was focused on the opioid crisis. So yeah, certainly the opioid crisis is a big part of kinship care right now. A lot of families are dealing with addiction issues and parents who are unable to parent because of that. And you know, certainly there are resources, and we've been working with OMH and OASIS, the state agencies that deal with mental health and substance abuse, to make kinship specific toolkits for kinship caregivers dealing with the opioid crisis. So we can send that link to the opioid crisis report around. As Ray mentioned, you know, being a kinship caregiver is challenging. You're being asked to raise a child typically with little to no notice. And so some of the caregiving concerns that a kinship caregiver is going to be thinking about as they get a child into their care, you can see here on this slide, include things like legal permanency. So what decisions can I make for the child in my home? And can this child stay here? Financial stability. Again, not every family is financially hard up, you know, but to a large extent, about 33% of kinship caregivers fall. We did a study in New York State between 2012 and 2015. We found about 33% of kinship caregivers fell 200% below the federal poverty line. So we're talking, you know, poor families taking children on because they love them and because they don't want them to be lost in a foster care system. They need help. Financial stability is an important part. School enrollment is an issue across the state. So a lot of times schools say, well, that's not your kid, so, you know, you can't enroll them in this school. We've had extensive talks with student support services at the state education department about trying to fix this, because when caregivers are asked to take children, or when caregivers step up and take children who, you know, have experienced trauma or are in need of being in school, having the school district be a part of the problem is not great. And then certainly they're being connected to other supports for caregivers and the kids in their care, whether that's counseling services for kids, again, who've experienced trauma, whether that's support groups for a caregiver, training. Again, if a caregiver is not becoming a foster parent, and very few in New York State do become foster parents, they don't have access to training about how to raise children who've experienced trauma like a normal foster parent would. And so local programs, online resources, these are important lifelines for these families who, you know, may have issues with children in their home. So Let's talk a little bit about that first bullet, legal options for caregivers. As Rae mentioned, there are a couple of different pathways in which someone becomes a kinship caregiver. One thing I think we should just kind of clarify as we're talking through this today is kinship care really refers to the relationship between the caregiver and the child, meaning that the caregiver of this child had a relationship with the child before that child came into their home. They're either a relative or a family friend, right? So oftentimes within the child welfare system, we shorthand kinship care to mean kinship foster care. And the reality of our system is that only 7,400 of the 193,000 kids are in kinship foster care. The rest fall under some other kind of custody arrangement. And you can see here, there are a number of different ways in which kinship caregivers are raising kids. Probably the largest cohort is informal custody. So the parents say, hey, will you take this kid, for a temporary amount of time, and they drop the kid off, and this caregiver is, tasked with raising a child, and custody doesn't change in court. They don't have a temporary order, nothing like that. Then you have legal custody orders. That's probably the second largest cohort that we're going to see in New York State. A lot of other states do guardianship orders instead of custody orders. Here in New York, we call it an Article 6 custody order. That's going to be the most popular way in which a court order is going to be issued for a kinship caregiver who's raising a child. Those things can look like joint custody with a parent, but physical custody residing with the caregiver, AKA the child lives with the caregiver, but shares decision-making responsibility between the grandparents or the kinship caregiver and the parent. Again, guardianship can happen through surrogates court, through family court, but typically we don't see a lot of guardianship in New York State. That is a little bit different from kinship guardianship, which you'll see a little bit below. Kinship guardianship, or KinGAP, is a result of foster care. So for those 7,400 kids who are in foster care, they can't stay in foster care forever. So they have to pick some kind of permanency outcome from foster care. Well, if you're a kinship foster parent, you can adopt like a non-kin foster parent. That requires a termination of parental rights. That requires the child to be freed for adoption. But kinship guardianship through the foster care program, KinGAP, does not require a termination of parental rights, can be achieved more quickly, depending on a permanency goal and outcome determined by the court and the county and the voluntary agency. It can be achieved more quickly, and instead of an adoption going through, you're getting a guardianship order. So that's where you're going to see the majority of guardianship orders in New York State is through KinGAP. And again, that stands for Kinship Guardianship Assistance Program. Direct custody is a placement mechanism that can be used by the Child Protective Agency. Sometimes it's called an Article 10 or an Article 1017 or an end docket placement. But direct custody means that CPS has been involved. They've removed the child from the home of the parent and given temporary custody to a caregiver. So technically the county does not have custody, but they maintain supervision over the case. So there's still reunification goals. It's kind of like permanency purgatory. So direct custody would mean that, the court still has oversight, the county still has oversight, but the case is not resolved. And you have to move from direct custody to some other form of permanency. So you might also think of direct custody as foster care on the cheap. All of the responsibilities of foster care, but you're not being paid like a foster parent. You haven't been given the access to the resources like a foster parent. Since 2012, about 16,000 children have gone into direct custody in New York State. Again, foster care is kind of like the highest level of support that a caregiver can get. But again, it's pretty rare compared to the total sum that children make it into kinship foster care. So again, when you receive a child, there's elements of care that you immediately begin to think about. So what does the law say about your ability to make certain decisions? How does the law recognize you? We're really proud to report that both the Assembly and the Senate in New York State have recently passed a bill that would define who a kinship caregiver is in statute. So that's an important thing in terms of recognition for the kinship community going forward. We're really excited and hope that the governor signs that into law fairly soon. Would be great. Again, what authority does a kinship caregiver have once they receive a child into their home? So can they enroll a child in school? Can they make educational decisions for the child? Can Johnny go on the school field trip? Can that caregiver sign that document that says, yes, Johnny can go on the school field trip? Medical care, what decisions can they make at the doctor's office? Can they even bring the child to the doctor? Again, the kind of custodial arrangement that they have with the child in their care speaks to what decision-making authority that they have. What records can they obtain? Birth certificates, social security card, passports, health and medical records. Again, some of these things are needed to, say, apply for public assistance. So if they are trying to access those supports that are available to them, what records do they have access to? Security. So can the child stay in my home? The child is now currently in my home through some form or another, whether given to me by Child Protective Services or a family arrangement. But can I keep the child in my home? What rights do the parents have to just come back and take the child at any time? If you don't have a court order, the parents have every right in the world to come back and take the child at any time. So if a child's coming from an unsafe situation, it's important that a caregiver finds a level of legal custody that works to ensure that the children are able to stay in their home. And then again, what about parent visitation? Well, if there's a court order that's directing parent visitation and giving guidelines and outlines for what that should look like, perfect. But if not, what does that look like? Again, these are all questions that kinship caregivers are going to need to address when they're given a child. What financial assistance is available and what resources are available? We're going to talk a little bit more about those things in a moment, so I'll leave that be. Again, just to kind of reiterate, the way a child is placed or is in care with a kinship caregiver determines the level of support that they're eligible for. So the previous slide about the decision-making authority and all of that stuff, what kind of custody they have, whether informal or formal in some way through a court order or foster parent, determines the level of support, the decision-making authority, all of that stuff. So it is important to know that kinship care has a multiplicity of different ways that a caregiver could be caring for a child, because it does impact what they're eligible for and what they can do. So certainly, as I mentioned before, kind of foster care is the most support a kinship caregiver can get. They get training on trauma. They can help, get financial stability through a foster care subsidy. The amount of a foster care subsidy is typically significantly more money than a kinship caregiver would get through public assistance or a child-only grant, which I'm going to be talking about shortly here. So again, that definitely matters. Kin gap and adoption, again, are kind of these permanency options that are really only available through foster care. So a kinship caregiver is not going to be able to get kin gap unless they've become a kinship foster parent first. And again, that requires being certified as a foster parent, going through the process of ASFA timelines or the Adoption and Safe Families Act to ensure reunification efforts are being made. A lot of that stuff that comes with foster care. So kin gap is kind of this small subset of the kinship world. OCFS reports how many caregivers go into kin gap, just to kind of give you because kin gap sucks up a lot of the air in the room. So it's really easy to be like, oh, kin gap this, kin gap that. Because there's a lot of laws written about kin gap and there's a lot of policy decisions made around kin gap. And if you're from a local county, you've probably heard from the state agency, we want to push more kin gap. Well, about 8,000 children come into foster care every year. And you saw on a previous slide, about 40% of all foster care in New York State is kinship foster care. So of those 8,000 kids that come into care, about 40% would potentially be eligible for kin gap. Well, for every 8,000 kids that come into care, about 8,000 exit care to some form of permanency, whether that's reunification with their parent or adoption or kin gap. Well, of those 8,000 kids that are exiting foster care, each year only between 400 and 500 exit to kin gap. The rest of the 7,500 kids are exiting to some other form of permanency, most often return to parent. But then you're looking at adoption or aging out or something like that. So KinGap is a very small portion of the kinship population. Again, I'm kind of reiterating this because it does take up a lot of the air in the room around kinship care. It's a very small portion. KinGap is essentially a subsidy to foster care. Here is the, it's the county saying to the caregiver, we want to close the foster care case. Here is the same subsidy that you were getting as a foster parent. The child will be eligible for that subsidy until they turn 21 in a lot of cases. And you're no longer a foster parent, you're now a guardian, and services close. There are permanency resource centers that are funded through some federal post-adoptive dollars that can serve post-KinGap, post-guard, or post-adoptive families. And they serve many counties around the state. But again, a small proportion of the kinship population. And then you've got custody and private cases. There are 25 counties in New York State that have an OCFS funded kinship care program. Those programs we're going to be talking a little bit more about later. So I'll just leave it at that. Resource centers cannot serve folks that have custody. They can only do guardianship and adoption. Same is reversed for these local kinship care programs. They can't serve guardianship or adoption. They can only serve custody or a case with no custody. Let's talk a little bit about public assistance, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Rae in a second. So as I've mentioned a couple times, there is public assistance available for this population. So if a child comes into the home of a kinship caregiver, about 95% of the time they're going to be eligible for something called a non-parent grant or a child-only grant. So in New York, that looks to be about $430 for one child. If you add a second child to that household, it looks about $150 extra total. For two children, you're looking at just over $600. So it's not a ton of money, but it is money that is available to the majority of the population. Those benefits are based on the child's income, not on the caregiver's income or the parent's income. It's based on, is the child getting any income into the home? That can look like child support, that can look like Social Security benefits, maybe disability from a parent, or if they have really high needs that have been identified previously, they might be getting SSI. So again, like, is that child getting income? If not, they're probably eligible for the child-only grant. In New York State, only 15% of eligible children are getting the child-only grant or the non-parent grant. So there's a lot of folks out there who are not accessing public assistance for the child in their care, while most of them are eligible. It is an effort that the New York State Kinship Navigator, as well as the local programs, OCFS, OTDA, are trying to address. We want more folks to be enrolled in this subsidy because it helps ensure stability and permanency for kids. Additional benefits that kinship caregivers are eligible for include Medicaid. Almost all, if not all, children are eligible for Medicaid in this world. So if healthcare is an issue, we want to make sure kinship caregivers are getting access to Medicaid. Childcare subsidies are available, SNAP and HEAP. We could go on and on. We have a lot of resources available on our website if you want to learn more about these things specifically. Again, other financial assistance that might be available to a kinship caregiver. If you make it into foster care, the foster care maintenance payment is almost always more money than the public assistance grant. For a child ages 6 to 11, you're looking at about $650 for one child, and it multiplies for a second child. So you're looking at about $1,300 for two children. KinGap subsidy and the adoption subsidy, again, only available if a caregiver has gone through foster care first. There are a number of, I already mentioned, Social Security, disability from a parent, or dependent survivor benefits. These are all different potential sources of income. And again, we're telling you, these professionals, about potential sources of income. This is something that a kinship caregiver needs to be thinking about from the moment that they get a child in their care, because as Rae mentioned, it's not cheap. It's expensive to do this work. So again, this is what the Navigator is here for. We're going to be talking a little bit more about kinship services, this is a good opportunity for me to turn it back over to Rae.
Thanks, Ryan. I feel like I sort of gave Ryan the lion's share of all the problems that kinship caregivers face. So we strategically placed that within the presentation. So now that we can say to you, okay, we have these common caregiving concerns that we see. What is out there for caregivers? So the next portion of our presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what services are available for caregivers that are boots on the ground across the state, and then what does the Navigator do for kinship caregivers. So Ryan talked a little bit about some of the support services. Here they are for you in bullet form. Across the state, we've got local kinship programs. There's 14 programs right now serving 25 counties in New York State. Those are funded by the Office of Children and Family Services. They typically provide case management services for caregivers. They're able to assist them in getting financial assistance, walk them through their legal options, provide support for the caregivers and children, support groups, intergenerational activities. A lot of these services went virtual during COVID, but now they are starting to make a slow comeback to in-person services. Every program services 2 counties. I'm going to show you a map in a minute about where they're located in the state. Most of them are in more metropolitan areas. New York City's covered, Rochester, Buffalo, really more the main areas in New York State. We've got the New York State Kinship Navigator. That's our program. We service the entire state. So we are not bound by any specific geography. We're not bound by any type of legal designation. We provide information, referral education for caregivers, prospective caregivers, and assistance to professionals working with kinship caregivers. There's regional permanency centers. Those service post-guardianship and post-adoptive families. There's one of those in every single county of the state. They are fantastic, but as Ryan mentioned, they are very bound by the population that they can serve, and there's not very many post-guardianship or post-adoptive families relative to informal kinship families in the state. There are other local programs. Office of the Aging has a great program in New York City, the Grandparent Resource Center, small programs across the state through the Office of the Aging that run support groups, grassroots support groups started by kinship caregivers. We've got all the information on our website, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they're spread across the state. There is also legal assistance for kinship caregivers, not as much as we would like, as always, but there are nonprofits that can assist caregivers with petitioning in family court. There's a wonderful one in Western New York called Center for Elder Law and Justice. They can help with assigned counsel. We have legal fact sheets on our website, online assistance with petition making. Again, not as much as we would like, but we're getting there. So the next couple of slides are really pictorials about what I've talked about. The first one is what the system of care looks like, a spreadsheet, a nice little snapshot there for you. We've got that on our website. We talk about what kinship caregivers look like in the state, kinship children, and then the 4 main programs that I just discussed. Statewide support from the Navigator, local kinship programs, regional permanency centers, and other support programs. And then our next pictorial is a map of the state. That is where the local kinship services that are case management services support kinship families. So as I said, there's 14 of them. They service 25 counties in the state. You'll see they're marked in purple. We've got Western New York covered. We've got Rochester. We've got some of Central New York, some of the Hudson Valley, and then down in Long Island in New York City. There's a lot of white on that map, which means that there's not a kinship program that serves boots on the ground caregivers with the most common custodians, informal caregivers. And that's where the Navigator comes into play. So the New York State Kinship Navigator is the only program in the state that services all kinship families. So as I said before, we service legal custodians, kinship foster parents, kinship caregivers that are prospective. They have not taken care and control of the children. Ones that have just stepped into care, those are our favorites because then we can give them all the information and make informed choices that they need to make. Our primary purpose is family stability. So really what we want to do is we want to provide that information and guidance for caregivers. We want to make sure that we can connect them to all of the local resources that are available to them. give them all of the information on their financial assistance options that Ryan laid out, all the information on their legal options, and to help provide advocacy for them if they are struggling with either one of those, and to partner with local Department of Social Services and Kinship Services. So when we get a call into our helpline from the Navigator, we first want to make sure that we're providing all the tools to that caregiver that they might need, answering what their options are for financial assistance, what their options are for legal permanency, and then making the connections to the boots on the ground services that are available for caregivers. So I've got a snapshot here really of what the information, education, referral, and advocacy looks like for the Navigator. Our main information conduits are through our helpline, which I'm going to give you a little bit more information about, but we are 10 to 4 Monday through Friday. We have a Kinship Navigator on staff that can speak with caregivers, prospective caregivers, professionals. We have an online chat on our website where you can go and ask a question in a chat box. We've got county resources on our website where you can pick a county. We have a clickable map where you can click on your county and find information on kinship services, other support services, legal information, county information, youth information. For every single county, it can direct you where the most appropriate resources are. And we have legal fact sheets. Ryan spoke about all of the legal options for kinship caregivers and financial assistance. We have, I think at last count, over 60 cited legal fact sheets on our website. They go through things like what is kinship custody, what is legal custody, legal guardianship, what is kinship foster care, kin gap, what is financial assistance, what is the temporary assistance available for families, how do I fill out that application, how do I enroll my child into school, how do I access legal documents like birth certificates, basically anything a kinship caregiver would need to know when they bring that child into their care. All of the fact sheets are cited, which means they refer to specific laws, but they're also written in a language that you or I could understand and a kinship caregiver could understand. So we want to make sure that we lay out all the information from them, right from the very beginning, but then give them the self-advocacy tools that they need and can understand. We provide referral services, so we refer to those local case management kinship programs. We can do facilitated referrals so that we can do a 3-way call or a release of information so that that local kinship program can reach out to the caregiver. We refer to support groups, different legal referral networks. We provide education, both for kinship caregivers and for professionals. We have statewide presentations like the one that we're doing today. We have an online video archive that we've got information on Kinship 101, Kinship Financial Assistant, Kinship Legal Options, and little video primers on how to fill out application for financial assistance, kin gap, COVID resources, virtual notarization, things of that nature. Basically what we want to do is we want to make sure we appeal to everybody's learning style. Some people are visual learners, some people want to read things, some people would rather speak over the phone. So we want to make sure that caregivers are feeling that they can understand all of the options available to them in the best way possible. We provide virtual case assistance in specific counties, which Ryan is going to talk about in a couple of minutes. And then we also provide advocacy for kinship caregivers. So that's done on a case-by-case basis. If a caregiver has questions about the amount of financial assistance they're receiving or questions about something in family court, we connect with other professionals in New York State to partner to make sure that we have resolution for things like that for kinship caregivers. We have statewide advocacy, which Ryan's going to talk about through our Kinship Coalition. So basically, aside from providing that information, referral, and education to caregivers, we're kind of the umbrella organization over kinship care in New York State. We provide a lot of the general advocacy, resources, assistance to professionals, and kinship caregivers. Next slide. Here's a snapshot of our website. Take a look if you get a chance. New York State, www.nysnavigator.org. I always keep meaning to make the screenshot a little bigger, but if you were to look at it on our homepage, it's got that map of New York State where you can click on any of the counties. You'll see some of these drop downs. We've got the online education where all our videos are, our legal resources where our legal fact sheets are organized by the different subheaders such as financial assistance, legal permanency options, education, etc. We've got our county resources that again brings you to our clickable map, information on kinship policy, how to get in touch with us. And then in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see chat with one of our agents. And from 10 to 4, Monday through Friday, you're able to just type in your name and whatever question you have, and one of our kinship navigators will get right back to you. We find a lot of professionals find this useful if they're working with a family or if they want to refer a family to us. It's a very quick way to get some information. Again, here's our helpline. This is our main way of connecting with caregivers. Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. We do have Kinship Navigator on staff at all times. We answer 95% of our calls live, and we have a backup answering service in case we miss a call. We'll return that call right away. We've got our intake available in 37 different languages. We partner with Catholic Family Center, who is the agency that provides services for us. They have language interpreting, so if somebody speaks Spanish, French, Chinese, anything, we've got you covered. You can have a caregiver call us and we will set up a 3-way with an interpreter. And then we also have comprehensive intake and database to collect data on these families so that we can better serve them. The last thing I want to talk about before turning it over to Ryan is our permission to contact form. And at this point in the presentation, I always say, if you remember nothing else but this in the hour, then we've done well, because we've thrown a lot of information your way. But the basic premise of this permission to contact form is how to get families in touch with us. So our permission to contact form is something that we piloted back in 2012 when we worked with 5 upstate departments of social services. And the whole premise of it was, you know, we've laid out this groundwork here. We have grandma, she just got this kid in her care. She's got to think about financial assistance, school enrollment, legal permanency. She has so much happening. If you give her information on the navigator, she may or may not pick up the phone to call us. But if we give her a permission to contact form, explain to her what the navigator is, have her sign the form, and the worker that is working with her faxes that form to us and we call her, then it's so much more likely that we're going to get in touch with her. We took a look at the numbers in those 5 counties where we piloted this permission to contact form. And in the first 2 years that we used it, we saw a 600% increase in reaching caregivers. And it's simply because we've taken the onus off of them to make the phone call. We're getting that caregiver right in the very beginning when they need all of that information. It's really helpful for child welfare workers. It's really helpful for school social workers that may see these caregivers come into their care. They see the children. Grandma may be lost and need some supports, but it's a good way for you to say, okay, this is a kinship caregiver. Let me sign this form, have them sign this form so that the navigator can get right in touch with them. So I'm going to show you a little picture of what this form looks like. We can attach this with any slides that we send out from today's presentation as well. It's a simple 2-page form. The front page shows a little bit about what the navigator does and that we will call you with your permission. The back asks for the caregiver's signature, the best way to get in contact with them, the best time to get in contact with them. We're Monday through Friday, 10 to 4, but we recognize that caregivers definitely work. So we are willing to call them before 10 o'clock or after 4 o'clock if that's easier for them. If they prefer email, if they prefer snail mail, basically the best way that is most convenient for them to be in touch with us, we will reach out. So if you're working with a caregiver and you have them fill this form out and you fax it to us, we get that right through our email. We will make contact with the caregiver within 48 hours of receiving that permission to contact form. If it's an emergency, we just ask you to write urgent across the top. And as soon as we get that in our email, we will make that phone call. We check our email every hour. If we don't get in touch with that caregiver the first time, we'll wait a week and we'll try again. If we don't get in touch with them the second time, we'll wait another week and try a third time. And if we're not successful the third time, we will send them an unable to contact letter that says, we were referred to you from the Department of Social Services. We tried calling you. Here's what we do. Please get in touch with us if you'd like more information or assistance. We generally have a lot of success with these permission to contact forms. We reach about 95% of caregivers that we get them in through. So the caregivers do want the help. They just may be less likely to reach out and call a number when they're given so much information in the very beginning. So our one ask off of this chat is, if nothing else, if you come across a caregiver, this form is right on our website. We're happy to send them to you in quantity. Feel free to use them. You can download the form. We've got the link right on our PowerPoint. Again, visit our homepage, and we're happy to send this out to you. We're happy to send out trifolds, brochures, posters, any type of outreach material. We do not want to be the state's best kept secret. We would really rather that every single caregiver that comes into a caregiving situation is in touch with us as soon as possible. Because the worst thing that we can hear at the Navigator is a caregiver calling us and saying, I've had my grandkid for the last 8 years. Is there help for me? And the answer is yes, of course there's help for you. But usually when we dig a little bit deeper and find out what their needs are, they may have been eligible for financial assistance for the last 8 years, and now we're just giving them the information, which is fantastic. But we really want to be able to give that to them in the very beginning. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan to talk a little bit about virtual case assistance, which is one of the Navigator's new endeavors.
Thanks, Rae. Definitely use the permission to contact form. We are always happy to talk to kinship caregivers. And if you're a professional and have questions about kinship care, we're happy to talk to you too. If you work in child welfare, then you are familiar with the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018. It's a federal act that was passed that basically flipped child welfare funding on its head. So historically, the Social Security Act, Title 4E, provided funds for foster care placements. You could get reimbursements for foster care placements if a child in your state or county met certain income thresholds and they were also in foster care. And back in 2018, the federal government said, too many kids, we're spending too much money and too many kids are going into residential treatment and they don't need to be there. And so they passed this act, which limited or hindered the ability for states and territories to be able to bill for Title 4E for children in group homes or residential treatment facilities if they don't need to be there, and incentivized instead the use of prevention services and kinship navigators. So family members, supporting family members who might step in to care for children in order to avoid foster care placements and especially group home placements. So as a part of that act, kinship navigators receive some funding to enhance and evaluate, and in some states establish, kinship navigator programs that are intended to help stabilize families who are caring for children outside of foster care. We have been doing a project on multiple levels in New York State since that money was made available. So that money became available early 2019. And so the Navigator has been running something we're calling virtual case assistance or virtual case management, which was very timely. We were about a year ahead of the pandemic. So we were already offering virtual case management before the pandemic hit. So we kind of were able to hit the ground running in terms of offering services virtually for folks. But then again, on the local level, we're also doing some peer support groups and getting peer mentors certified under a peer mentorship program that's offered through Families Together New York State's mental health organization. We work closely with them to do a training to get more peer mentors to operate within the kinship provision of care. So those are the two projects that are going on in New York. Every year, it's kind of like, is there going to be more funding to continue these projects to see if they can meet an evidence-based standard that was put forth by the feds as a part of the Families First Act? And they are continuing to do so. We're about to enter our fourth year of that project to continue to evaluate. The evaluators, the Center for Human Services Research, they're located in Albany, New York, out of SUNY Albany. So we're working towards evidence-based programming that would allow Kinship navigators, so not just the Kinship Navigator, but, you know, as Rae mentioned, we're kind of an umbrella agency, the local programs that we've partnered with to offer peer support. You know, any program that's serving kinship caregivers would be considered a Kinship Navigator under the federal definition, would be eligible for federal dollars to match the investment that the state puts in towards kinship programs. So right now in New York State puts $2.5 million towards kinship services. So that funds the Kinship Navigator and the 14 local kinship programs. So under the federal, the Families First Act, we'd be eligible for a 50% match up to $1.25 million for additional services. So it's not a ton of money, especially when you consider the foster care system is funded at about $1.3 billion for 15,600 kids in foster care. So it's a pretty big difference between the two service systems, but we are pretty successful in ensuring that folks get access to the resources they're eligible for. As Rae mentioned, we have virtual case assistance in a couple of counties, again, as a part of this project where we're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of this service. You can see here we're covering Warren, Washington, Saratoga, Rensselaer, Fulton, Otsego, and Montgomery, hoping to continue to expand our reach to a few other counties in the future. You can keep an eye out for what counties this might be expanded to on our homepage as well. But right now, what virtual case assistance really is, it's different from our normal service, which our normal service you can kind of equate to like a 211. Someone needs information, they need a referral, they need to know what their options are. They can call our helpline and get that information in kind of like a 211 fashion. And again, as Rae mentioned, we do follow up and try to ensure that folks get connected and got the information they needed. This is more handholding. This is more like case management. Again, it's done virtually. It's not in-person case management. But when someone calls from one of the counties that has access to virtual case assistance, they're assigned a case manager who is going to work with them for up to 6 months to ensure that, you know, their needs are being met, to ensure that they've been able to apply for the benefits they're eligible for, they've been referred to the local services that they're eligible for. So they're getting followed up with regularly, sometimes weekly, but at a minimum, usually once a month, to make sure that their needs are being met. They're being asked to enroll in part of the study through the Center for Human Services Research and are eligible for a Walmart gift card if they enroll in our study. If you're interested in more information about virtual case assistance and the services that we're offering through that, again, our homepage is where to find that information. One of the little colors in the middle says stuff about virtual case assistance, so you can check that out. As Rae mentioned, we have online education as well as legal resources, informational fact sheets related to all kinds of topics, but certainly relevant right now is information related to COVID-19 and resources specific to caregivers. So we do have a video available under online education about COVID resources and things to be looking out for, things like telemental health, telemedicine, caregiving without going to court. The caregiving without going to court certainly has been an important one during this time because most courts are closed or have been closed for a long time. They're super backed up. And again, it doesn't stop the caregiver from having to make decisions on behalf of a child in their care. So there are ways in which a parent can designate parental power of attorney to a caregiver that some do require virtual notarization, others don't. So again, we have information on our website related to COVID-19. You can see the pink line on the top of our homepage right there. You can click that link to get access to all of the different things that are related to COVID and kinship care. So we recommend you check that out. Ray did mention that we operate a KinCare Coalition. If you're interested in being a stakeholder on the coalition, we've got about 175 or so folks who get a bi-monthly update from the coalition about what's going on in the kinship world and how you can participate to help the cause of kinship care. So we encourage you to check that out. You can check that out at kincarecoalition.org. We do have a newsletter that goes out bi-weekly. If you're interested in signing up for that newsletter, certainly let us know. We'd be happy to sign you up for that. You can reach out to one of us in just a second. Please, again, use the permission to contact form. It is available on our homepage. The other thing that you can do to help celebrate kinship care is September. Every year we have September as Kinship Care Month. This is celebrated in New York by resolution. The Assembly, the Senate, and the governor. Governor does a proclamation. The Senate and the Assembly do resolutions declaring September as Kinship Care Month in New York. So you can celebrate kinship caregivers during the month of September by posting about them on social media or referring them to services if you happen to know them. Again, if you are interested in having us do something like this for your regional office or your school or your whatever you're doing, we do this stuff all the time. We'd be happy to do that. So please reach out, and you can reach us at these links here. I think we have maybe a little bit of time for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to, I'm going to actually turn it over to Amelia. She can tell you what to do about questions.
Yeah, if you have any questions, just throw them right into the chat. I do have one question that someone DM'd me, and they are now a social worker that works with the aging population, but they used to work in trying to coordinate kinship care, and they're from a rural area. And they said that it's extremely hard to find folks that are closer to where the child is living in a rural area. They're wondering if your form to contact folks is something that they could mass email out to large groups at the same time.
Absolutely. Any reach that we possibly can have to the caregivers, we're the more help, the better. So it very much so in the rural counties, we see that there's more kinship caregivers out there that are able to get in contact with us, and it's really just an outreach, a communication thing. So feel free to spread that permission to contact form mass, any brochures or flyers that we can email to you or mail to you. Just feel free to get in contact with either one of us, and we'll make it happen. Thank you.
Awesome. We also have another question. Can you speak to any challenges around the state, such as organizations closing or services ending abruptly, I believe, from COVID?
I can't really speak to any of them ending abruptly because of COVID. I know that we've had some challenges in terms of budgetary reallocations. It's always the kinship caregiver programs, every couple of years they're reshuffled and there's new services offered, new RFPs go out. They recently just went through a change in services for counties for caregivers. Generally, the services still stay in place. They just may change a little bit in terms of the scope of services that they can offer. So what we try to do is we partner with those organizations. Sometimes the navigator's taking on a little bit more of a role there to support the caregivers than they previously did. I just want to answer the other question on chat too. The permission to contact form is right on our homepage. So if you go to our website, you can download the permission to contact form. We do have trifolds and flyers right on our website as well. But if you need those emailed to you, please, feel free, send Ryan or an email, and we'll make sure you've got the resources that you need.
And if I can just chime in to the question about challenges such as organizations closing or caregivers losing services, we mentioned that the Navigator does do kind of case-by-case advocacy. If there is a specific issue that you as a social worker or you as a stakeholder have come across that a caregiver has faced because of a drop in services or because of whatever reason, let us know. We have a lot of connections with the state, with different state agencies like OTDA. So if it's a public benefits issue, we can help advocate around that. If it's a custodial issue or a foster care issue, we have a lot of contacts at the Office of Children and Family Services. We can help advocate around that. So, if you're finding that you're working with a caregiver, or you know of somebody who has a problem because of a loss of services or because of a custodial issue, we want to help them, and we will, be more hands-on than that 211 for folks who are flagged for us. So please let us know. We want to make sure that folks are taken care of.
Awesome. I just want to thank you so much for the presentation today, and let everyone know that this will be sent out in our member update with all the information on this screen, and I'll include a link to that permission to contact form so we can get that to everyone. But thank you so much, Rae and Ryan, for joining us today. And is there anything you'd like to say to close out?
Thank you for the opportunity. We appreciate it, all the questions. And, feel free, if you've got any questions following up after the fact, email either Ryan or I. We're more than happy to step in. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you both. Have a great day, everyone.
You too. Thanks.